Today's lecture is on the Spring 2022 UILLD topic. In matters of foreign policy, the United States ought to value universal human rights over economic interests. With the Biden administration recently making a new policy that all goods imported from a particular region in China, Xinjiang region, are not made with forced labor, is really kind of bringing this issue to light in the popular media and in popular dialogue. Really kind of ask this question of how much economic pressure to be willing to put on another country in order to protect human rights. In this lecture, I'll discuss some important terms, the affirmative arguments and the negative arguments. So let's get some terms. The first of all, in the United States. This is really talking about what the United States should do. It becomes a question of what can the United States accomplish and also kind of what are its own economic interests. The second term is, of course, ought or value. This is a value proposition. But of course, values, consequences are relevant to value propositions, right? If we look at basic utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, those can come into play as well. Universal human rights. Universal human rights are obviously difficult to define, but there are 30 established human rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And these range from everything kind of to be free from discrimination, right, to protection of the right not to be tortured. It includes things like the right to rest and leisure time. So just thinking practically in terms of your debate topic, should we sacrifice our own economic interest to prevent people from being tortured? Arguably, you could make a strong case for that. Should we sacrifice our own economic interest so some other people have a little more rest and leisure time? That's probably a harder case to sell. Now, of course, we're not kind of talking about particular rights, but the idea here that I want you to understand is that there is a broad spectrum of rights that are discussed under kind of the idea of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, economic interests. The one thing the resolution doesn't say is who, right? Are these the economic interests of the United States? Are these the economic interests of the target country? Or should we think about both? Now, just as a couple highlights, right, of the United States, right, the resolution is talking about what the United States should do. So arguably, it should at least prioritize its own economic interests, right? That's kind of one thing that's relevant. But also, the economic interests of the target country. If the economic interests of the target country is hurt, then to go back to our simple thing of kind of rest and leisure, there's probably going to be less rest and leisure. At a very minimum, there's also probably going to be a lot of poverty. But that's something that the resolution doesn't really say. To what economic interest, though it kind of implies that you're pitting kind of the U.S. economic interests against the protection of human rights. Now, obviously, this is a value topic, right? But I say policy questions can be relevant, as you know, right? From doing Lincoln Douglas debate, right? Policy questions can be relevant, especially in concepts of utilitarianism. But so just looking at this briefly, how would a country value kind of human rights over its economic interests? Would it refuse trade agreements with the country at issue? Could it just maybe reduce trade itself? Say, hey, we're not going to allow you to export these particular goods to the United States anymore. We're not going to let any of our industry buy these. This is essentially a sanction. There could be financial transaction sanctions. We'd say we're not going to allow and we're going to do any business with this bank. We're not going to allow particular individuals in your country to have transactions like through this financial institution. Those would be financial side industry sanctions. And of course, we have maybe just diplomatic statements. We could say that we would prefer this. I don't think the debates are going to get into kind of the details of those questions, but the general questions, for example, like sanctions and maybe trade, are gonna come up, particularly sanctions. I think sanctions should come up because that is the most direct way that we would prioritize. So a sanction could obviously hurt the country that's putting the sanction on because it reduces their trade opportunities, but they're more designed to protect human rights. Now, we'll go into each of these in a bit more detail, but what are some of the kind of the major pro-arguments just to kind of preview it, right? One is that human rights would be improved. I put in parentheses, good luck, because it's actually quite difficult to win, that these sanctions are going to really kind of accomplish much of anything. And I'll talk more about that later. The second is what we call shunning. There's literature that just says, hey, we shouldn't support the efforts, we shouldn't kind of support or be friends with, right? You think of that if you have a friend who's doing something bad, you say you're going to shun them. You don't want to be friends with them anymore. We don't want to associate ourselves with people who are committing human rights violations. And third thing you could have is U.S. leadership, just in general, right? Regardless of the effectiveness, you'd say, well, it's important for the United States to take a stand, to be a leader in the world, to kind of protect human rights and promote the democracy that's kind of comes with the human rights. Like one of the things that, one of the defining features of a democracy is the protection of human rights. And if we're really going to be the champion of democracy in the world, we should be interested in protecting human rights. You could also, at like a policy level, say, hey, well, there's this broader policy debate about whether free trade itself and economic growth are good. Debaters will get into those arguments. And I think what you really want to look at and really want to question, if you can argue on the pro that those things are bad, then you can essentially kind of turn what are the primary negative argument against this, the economic interests, back against this. But let's kind of just the basics of the human rights argument, right? The affirmative is going to say that we need to improve human rights, that there are violations of human rights, and you could give some particular examples, right? If you want to talk about globally that are occurring, you're probably going to talk about maybe some particular countries where there are human rights issues. Obviously, kind of China is one of the ones that pops up just because China is frequently criticized as, a country that violates human rights. And now there's all this talk about, whether the U.S. should put more pressure on these. We've had sanctions placed on Russia for their violations of human rights. This came up in the context of Syria. The United States sanctions North Korea for a lot of different reasons, probably primarily security reasons, but there are a lot of human rights violations that occur there. And you can see that, like in many other regimes, the United States has had a complete embargo, which is really an economic blockade on Cuba for I think 70 years now. This has been going on, right? So you can talk about those and then say, hey, we need to protect these human rights. These human rights are important to people's individual dignity, to prevent them from suffering, maybe to give them opportunities to, be part of a democracy. And then I think, like I said earlier, the harder argument to win is that U.S. leadership or this economic pressure is going to push these countries into improving their human rights situation, which is the hard part of the argument to win, right? It's not hard to win that there are a lot of human rights violations that occur in the world. It's not hard to win that human rights violations are bad, especially when you're debating in front of a Western audience. It's really difficult to win that the United States pressure on this issue is going to make a difference, but it's definitely something that you should try. The second argument that I mentioned earlier was shunning, right? We're going to say, look, these human rights violations are immoral, and we have a moral obligation to kind of shun individuals, institutions. Those institutions can be governments that both engage or at least support or maybe even just turn a blind eye to those human rights violations. And if we don't shun, that we are complicit. Of course, this says that utilitarian ethics, the greatest good for the greatest number, is not what's important. We should really just kind of take a strong stand. And I think that this is an argument that's a little stronger, and it seems weaker in that they, say, okay, well, we're going to shun somebody. We're not going to be complicit. What's exactly the impact to that? That's a little tougher, honestly, than the impacts on the first side, right? Or the first argument about improving. It's just the solvency for this is going to be greater, right? You're kind of essentially saying through these trade protections, we're going to disassociate ourselves. Then we have kind of questions of U.S. leadership, right? Which I mentioned. We say, right, now this again doesn't depend on solving human rights. It's just on the United States taking a stand. And one thing that's important to understand if you haven't had a lot of history yet is that post-World War II, right, U.S. leadership around the world was really kind of established, or at least partially so, right? The United States, kind of the Western Alliance, kind of won World War II. And then the United States really pushed through the United Nations, right? Things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the support for democracy around the world. we're kind of known for this, and we really kind of spent the entire post-war period building up, even today, what is kind of this liberal international order. And this helps us develop our soft power. Joseph Nye of Harvard University says there are three elements to national power: economic power, military power, and he added his unique contribution to soft power. So how much somebody likes you. And he says that kind of integrating these, right, having respectable ideals, then kind of supports your economic interests through trade. It supports your military interests through allowing bases. It's a kind of a big part of U.S. global leadership and world order. And of course, just our ability to promote democracy generally. And there's a lot written about that now, that the United States needs to take a stronger stand in favor of promoting democracy, because you have countries like China that don't support democracy, Russia, that are increasing their influence around the world. So I think those are kind of your mainstream arguments as to why it's good to prioritize human rights over economic interests. Like I said, you could also make some arguments about why economic growth is bad, though I'm not going to go into those in this discussion. On the con, I think there's some major arguments you can make, and we'll go into these in more detail. One, that they're a total failure. This economic pressure, that it increases poverty and nationalism, that it's not in the national interest of countries, their own national interests, right? We need to look out for our own national interests, or we're going to have problems. Our own countries could be undermined, that it's bad to engage in this moralizing. It actually encourages aggression and imperialism against other countries. Now, of course, those are all our offensive arguments as to why it's bad to prioritize human rights over our economic interests. But before I even get into those, I want to kind of just look at kind of some of the basic problems with universal human rights. The core idea here, is universal. I don't know that there's any society that doesn't think that there are any human rights. I mean, maybe some, right? North Korea might be an extreme example, but, even you look at China, where people are constantly criticizing it for its human rights, like they do think that, people shouldn't be poor, that they should have kind of a very minimal amount of income or really cheap access to healthcare, right? So they don't support human rights like free speech, right? That's more of a uniquely U.S., at least Western U.S. human right? Right, but they support other things that you could easily define as human rights. But this kind of list of 30, this, the idea of it being universal, right? This came from the United States. This came from the West, the victors of World War II, who kind of created, these documents like in the image of the United States, right? So universal human rights, I think, are really Western human rights that, we're now then trying to apply against other countries. The second thing is that there's really not a foundation for human rights beyond society. What do I mean by that? Unless you're a really religious person, where do human rights come from? Right? If they don't from God, where do they come from? Well, they come from society. They come from kind of what is a social contract that people agree to, right? Some of these are informal, right? We just kind of support basic ideas of maybe rest and leisure time that's not in the Constitution. Others may be put into the Constitution, right? Okay, you have a right not to be falsely imprisoned. That can be in the Constitution. Some are more ideals, right? But beyond our society, unless you're a religious person, and obviously religions disagree as to what these human rights are, that's it. So if a society doesn't believe in these human rights, then what is the foundation? There's also no agreement as to what they are, right? As I just mentioned, some countries support free speech. The United States is probably I think in my experience, the strongest proponent of kind of almost unlimited free speech. Even in other democracies, free speech rights are not as strong. And of course, certainly in countries like China, they're weaker. And, a country like North Korea, they don't exist at all. Right. But there's kind of a lot of disagreement as to what human rights should be protected, how much protection they should receive. So it kind of questions the idea of universality. Like I said, many are silly or kind of aspirational. Yes, we should have more leisure time. Right? It's not really definable, or what does it mean? You shouldn't have to work 80 hours a week. Well, do you get free food if you don't? It's not, if you don't have enough money after you're done working your 40-hour week, it's not really clear, right? There's no really practical way to protect these beyond society, right? The U.S. could take a stand. I say the U.S. can shun people, but is really the United States going to get China to just kind of change, or Russia to change the way they run their countries to protect human rights? influence at best probably at the margins. And of course, you could also make the argument that it's a bit hypocritical, right? Like, there's a lot of criticisms of the United States for the way it treats human rights. Like, we have like percentage of population that more people in prison than I think any country in the world, right? And obviously a lot of those are minorities, especially like blacks and Hispanics. Look at all the trouble we had at the border with that family separation policy, right? Like, who are we? The argument is, who is the United States to really kind of be out there like criticizing other countries' human rights? There's also kind of then, that's some defensive arguments against kind of the idea of human rights. Then there's kind of also arguments that kind of putting on this economic pressure is a complete failure. Like, we've had an economic embargo on Cuba, a complete blockade basically of Cuba. There's very few exceptions, right? To this embargo of Cuba for like basically around 70 years, and the country is still not democratic. There are arguably human rights violations still occurring. Russia, right? We have all kind of sanctions on Russia right now. They're always imprisoning political prisoners, murdering opposition figures. The sanctions don't seem to have accomplished anything. Iraq, it's kind of a rough place to live. Syria, I mean, you had the president of Syria, Assad, gassing his own people. I don't think U.S. sanctions made any difference there. North Korea, horrific human rights violations there, right? If your family member commits a crime, a crime against the government, they may put you in prison and like torture you, right? Horrific human rights violations despite really almost complete sanctions. You say China, you can say, well, hey, they're engaging in these certain human rights violations. Their economy is almost as strong as ours. Are we going to really push them? U.S. has had sanctions on Venezuela forever. There's really no been change in the regime. It's hard to win that sanctions are effective. I coached a policy debate topic, I think it was in 2003 or 2004, is about economic sanctions. And it's basically impossible to defend that like economic sanctions worked at all, that they were all effective. I've coached other topics like Cuba, Venezuela, and like more of a micro level. It's impossible really to win that sanctions there were effective. We had a debate topic about sanctions on Russia. Again, it was really impossible to argue that they made like any difference, at least in terms of achieving their objectives, right? In terms of like human rights or democratization. So it probably doesn't make a lot of sense, arguably, to kind of prioritize the protection of human rights in other countries over your own economic interests when the outcome is just a complete failure. Of course, there can be economic harms not just to the country that imposes the sanctions. So, for example, what I mean is if we trade less with China, right, that could hurt our economy. But also in these other countries, there can be massive poverty because the people who live there are denied trade opportunities and opportunities to develop economy. They may not be able to gain access to key medicines. And the wealthy, and one of the reasons the sanctions don't work is the wealthy escape kind of the consequences because they hoard all the resources, right? Like Kim Jong-il in North Korea, like even though he's heavily sanctioned, he's not poor. There are a few resources in that country because of the trade sanctions, but he's hoarding the resources. Same with Putin and all the other oligarchs. Some people say this is so extreme, it could even be like considered to be genocidal. And of course, there are trade conflicts, and trade conflicts, if we're going to put on a trade penalty, that could produce a larger trade war. Of course, there's potential for other types of conflict. You have a lot of nationalism, right? Like, people in China, for example, are proud of their country, right? And they're not all supporters of protecting all forms of human rights, right? That we consider human rights. They're not the biggest proponents of free speech. So when the United States comes in and says, hey, you need to change the way you run your country, that's to kind of produce some nationalist opposition. No different than if China said, hey, United States, you got to change the way you run your country. You should be a communist country. You shouldn't be a democracy. Like, that really wouldn't go over well here with most people. So you kind of have a political backlash that occurs that can create nationalism and even the propensity for conflict. Then there's kind of a subset of arguments that, I'll be kind of talking about these policy consequences, but some more philosophical things. So what does it mean? Like, why should we prioritize human rights in other countries over our own national interest, right? National interest kind of has three components. There's security interests, economic interests, and ideological interests. Ideological interests would be like, hey, we're committed to democracy, right? why should we kind of sacrifice our own national interest in terms of our economic interest for another country? In popular parlance, we know this is kind of America first, which is obviously like kind of taken a little bit of a, rhetorical beating because, Trump supported it. Some people don't like Trump, right? And maybe some people think it kind of took the idea too far. It's always kind of a little bit of a give and take. But America first, or the national interest, which is the popularized version of that, is grounded in what are really realist theories of international relations. A realist, I think, would probably kind of maybe generally say two things. One is that countries are always going to act in their self-interest, right? So if country A is going to act in its self-interest regardless, and then country B, right, needs to then act in its own self-interest, right? Like, just like you don't want to sacrifice your own interest if your friend is not actually kind of willing to sacrifice their interest for you, right? So, okay, and then B, as it kind of say that these interests are best protected by protecting security, economics, and ideology, right? So why are we gonna? So the argument is that if we undermine our own national interest, then we threaten kind of basically the foundation of like our own country, and countries that don't kind of protect their own economic interests will fail. So I think that's kind of just kind of in terms of values, that's like a clear competing value, right? So you may find yourself in an area, or a circuit where kind of the policy arguments are a little more relevant. You're debating utilitarianism. We discuss those. If it is more values, then I really kind of suggest kind of unpacking these arguments a lot more. And of course, then, and a second thing, right, all this moralizing, right? The idea of protecting human rights over our national interests really is based on the idea of moralizing, right? That, hey, we have this moral claim that people, other places should be doing the right thing. Well, this can lead to like military intervention, right? Or we can say, right, there's kind of Uncle Sam there, like protecting, saying, hey, go get human rights. Well, we're going to protect them under the power of our gun. And it leads to violence against those with different values. And of course, it threatens the foundation. It's another way it threatens the foundation of the country because of our own country, because we're really putting in a lot of we're putting in a lot of foundations, a lot of our economic resources, I guess I should say, into developing a military. And then we're using some of that military to protect other people's human rights. And of course, you have basic ideas of imperialism, right, which is kind of a bit of a takeoff on that, just a little bit of a different articulation, right, that we're going and we're invading societies with the idea that we want to fix them. And this can lead to kind of genocide in and of itself. And finally, I'll give you like just the last thing, right? And talked about this earlier, right? But what about animal rights, right? Why should we prioritize human rights? You should be focusing on animal rights. And I included some evidence there. But anyhow, those kind of cover the core components of the topic. We do have a lot of evidence on this topic that's available for all of our subscribers to download.